Hi, everyone. Welcome to Azure User Group Sweden. I'm glad that you're here today, and I hope that you're having a great weekend. My name is Jonah Anderson. I'm one of the community leaders of Azure User Group Sweden. And today I don't have Håkan with me. Unfortunately, he couldn't join me today, but the show must go on, and we have great speakers sharing about GitHub and Azure DevOps today. And before we put them on stage, I would like to share about our code of conduct. So our code of conduct is that we just want everyone to be nice and friendly and respectful to others when you ask questions, and be open and curious with everyone. And before we get started, let's welcome our speakers, Sander and also Kevin. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Sander and Kevin. Really nice to have you live on Azure User Group Sweden today, and we're excited to learn more from you. Yes. And yeah, can you tell us more about yourself? Maybe you already have it in your presentation, a bit about yourself.
Yeah, we have a bit about ourselves in our bios during this
Yes.
session anyway. So, but to cut a long
Yes.
story short, we both live in the Netherlands and
Yes.
we're Britain.
Yes. Yeah. Uh, it's great to have you here. Okay, let's start. Can you please share your screen
Yeah.
for your presentation?
So,
Okay, let's see. Let me share the screen.
and
All
here we
right. Yeah, here we go.
go.
You have the stage. Thank you.
Okay, then. Well, welcome everybody to today's session, GitHub and Azure DevOps Duet, Sundsvall, Sweden edition, and I hope I pronounced Sundsvall correctly there. It's a tale about how a development team and an operations team must bond together and start using GitHub and Azure DevOps together for data platform deployments.
So for the next 60 minutes or so, we'll be talking both about Azure DevOps and GitHub, and we're going to be figuring out how to use both together to do a full application management lifecycle, from creating a work item all the way to its release. And we'll be discussing both the cloud and on-premise versions of them both, as well as the features that are most suitable for the source control, the boards, the CI/CD pipelines, the artifacts, and test plans. And at the end of this session, you'll have a basic understanding of the features in both GitHub and Azure DevOps, and how you can use them together for your data platform deployments.
So, to give this session some context, one of us is from the SQL development team and the other from the SQL operations team. Our manager has decided that both teams will merge into one DevOps team so that we're all one big happy family. Now, our development team has been heavily using GitHub, and our production team the same for Azure DevOps. After much debate, they've asked us to very nicely to figure out how to use both together to get the best out of both offerings. So, when people think of using Azure DevOps or GitHub to work in a DevOps related way, they think of using it to deliver Azure services like this, which is becoming more and more common these days, especially within large organizations. Responsibility lies within certain teams to do their own Azure deployments using CI/CD based methods. So as you can see here, they tend to go from a development environment to integration, UAT, and then potentially production environment as well for all of their cloud services they'll be using together. And that's what we've been asked to do as well. However, in addition to that, we've also been asked to do this, which is becoming a bigger expectation these days as well. Not just for SQL Server related deployments, but also for a vast array of other applications as well. So more and more businesses are expecting things to be delivered using CI/CD methods. As you can see here, this is a standard Azure SQL database. A table update gets done in a development environment, and it's expected to go through a deployment pipeline to have a level of automated deployments until such a stage where an approval may be required, whether that's a manual approval or an automated approval done by doing something like checking statistics in Azure Monitor, for example. And these are the challenges that we face when implementing DevOps, especially when it involves teams like operations and development teams that are merging together.
In reality, this is a real gradual process. However, since this is only a 60-minute session, we've taken it upon ourselves to speed up this process. In addition, our manager has decided that the development team lead will be the Scrum Master and operations team lead will be the product owner.
So, for those of you who don't know, the product owner is responsible for translating business needs into workable backlog items for Scrum sprints, which means they must meet the stakeholders at various levels within the business. In addition, they are ultimately responsible for prioritizing those work items, even though they may get input about those priorities from various stakeholders.
And the Scrum Master's role is to empower the team to do those backlog items by encouraging how they work and removing any impediments if they appear.
Yeah, and since we got asked about this at the start of the session as well, Sander, let's introduce ourselves.
Yes, shall we? So I'm Sander. I'm a SQL Server DBA living in the Netherlands. I have about 20 years experience in IT and over 15 years with SQL Server. I'm a cloud and data center MVP, which means I do a lot of stuff with PowerShell and DevOps and sorts alike. I'm a major contributor to the DBA Tools project, and I work for Data Masterminds. You can follow me on Twitter. I have a blog. If you have any questions after this session, feel free to send me an email. All the demos you'll see from me today will be available on my GitHub page as well. Go to the presentations repository, find this session, and you will find the demos right there. They're free for you to use, to change, and reteach. They're yours to do whatever you want to do with them. And now Kevin has a slightly more complicated bio than me, so go ahead, Kevin.
Well, thanks for that, Sander. And yeah, my name is Kevin Chant, and I'm a lead BI and analytics architect living in the Netherlands. However, as some of you might be able to tell from the accent, I'm actually originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman living in the Netherlands, working for a French-based company because he met a woman in Australia. Now, whenever I say this out loud, I realise why Sander says this is complicated. Now, I've worked in IT since the days of Windows 95, and that's probably as much as I should say about that. And over that time, I've had experience in various sectors, including the banking, oil, and health insurance industries. And at one stage, I was actually a product owner for a data platform team as well, which is relevant for this session. And in addition to that, I have various certifications, including both the old and the new style MCSE. I'm also a Microsoft Certified DevOps Engineer expert, which is fairly relevant for this session, and a Microsoft Data Platform MVP as well. And just like Sander, you can find me in various ways on social media. And I have a few repositories that may be of use to some of you using Azure DevOps in GitHub. So now we've got that out of the way, the first thing to discuss is whether to use both services in the cloud or install the server versions on premises. Personally, I'd like to use the on-premises versions for security and reporting reasons. However, the downside is we'd have to deploy multiple servers with those services on for business continuity reasons. Plus, we may have to wait a while for new features to be available because of the cloud-first strategy. And in addition to that, Sander, we'd have to maintain and patch all those servers as well.
But if you use the services in the cloud instead, you wouldn't have to patch and maintain anything. It's all done behind the scenes for you. Plus, it's easier to install extensions from the marketplace for both Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions.
Well, that's true, and we can still secure them. Besides, whichever we use, we must still consider security and compliance anyway to keep our auditors happy. Luckily, both are well structured and they're easy to manage.
Remember that if we use a cloud-based product, we have other versions to choose from as well.
I know for Azure DevOps there's only two versions, which is the Azure DevOps Cloud Services and Azure DevOps Server, which you install on premises. So what GitHub versions are available? Because I thought there was only the free version or enterprise to choose from.
Oh, there's more than a couple, Kevin.
Well, since you just mentioned it, you might as well list them all here.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if anybody knows if they want to guess, but the first one that you can actually use for GitHub is the GitHub free for user accounts. Then we have GitHub Pro, which comes with extra features like pull request reviewers. We then have GitHub free for organizations, which includes team discussions, which is really a handy feature for collaboration with other members of your team. And this is good for entry-level teams. Then we have GitHub Team, which introduces a lot more features than the free version. For example, we also, like with GitHub Pro, we have team pull request reviewers. Then there's GitHub Enterprise, which is the first version that is actually able to be installed on premise as well as in the cloud. It has GitHub Connect for unified contributions, and it makes you can manage your billing for GitHub organizations in an easier way. And at last, there's GitHub One, which has all the features of GitHub Enterprise, along with additional support, insights, and advanced security.
How can security in GitHub Enterprise get any more advanced?
Well, we could do things like we do in the public repositories, like code scanning and dependency reviews, which are in the private repositories, which is not available in any private version, private repositories, only in the public ones.
Okay. Well, I'll see if I can find a link shortly to put more details about the various GitHub products in the chat as well, since we can actually, there you go, since we can actually put things in the comments section on StreamYard for everybody.
So anyway, I know we can configure authentication on Azure DevOps services or GitHub Enterprise to store repositories for some Azure data engineering services like Azure Synapse Analytics as well. So the main points we want you to take away from this section is there are multiple versions of both these products. There are very good free versions for you to try out and get acquainted with them. If you want to do installs on premises, you have to patch and maintain everything yourself. Whereas with the cloud-based version, everything is done behind the scenes for you. Plus, if you do stuff like on-premise, you need OAuth integration to easily integrate with services like Synapse Studio and Azure DevOps with an Azure DevOps repository. And with on-premise, you are limited to, at least with the GitHub, very limited to which version you can actually choose to install on-premise.
Yeah. So since we just mentioned about how both are structured, we will just quickly go through now and give you a very, very quick introduction to how both offerings are actually structured together. Just bear with me a moment. So first of all, let's cover Azure DevOps. So this is basically your main, you can call it homepage if you want, your account for Azure DevOps. As you see on the left-hand side, you have access to one or more organizations, which can be the company you work for, or if you're in a large enterprise, a division within it. If you have the right permissions, you can change various settings at the organization level. We're not going to dive too deeply into these today because there's quite a few different settings you can change. Just be aware that they're there and they can be quite useful and important. Now, each Azure DevOps organization has access to one or more projects. And if I click on one of these projects, you can see the default services on the left-hand side here. So Azure Boards, Azure Repos, Azure Pipelines, Azure Test Plans, and finally Azure Artifacts. And just like at the organization level, if you have the right permissions, you can change a whole load of settings at the project level as well. And in reality, these are usually the permissions that most people who, manage Azure DevOps for the teams effectively have. And it's worth experimenting with these different settings as well. Do you want to do the same with GitHub, Sander, for everybody?
Yeah, so let me share my desktop. So share screen.
We need some interlude music whilst you do this.
So if I'm right, you can see my screen right here.
Indeed.
So this is our organization. If we have all our repositories right here, so you can also go to repositories and see what has actually been active as well. You can go through the packages, the people who are in your organization, and make more one teams, because then you can divide everything between projects. Talking about projects, you can make multiple projects in your organization, and depending on your the same with Azure DevOps, depending on the privileges you have, you can set all kinds of settings for the organization as well. If we dive into one of the repositories, we have other settings that we can do. We can create issues, pull requests, discussions that I mentioned before, to collaborate with other members of my team. The actions, which we will see later on in the session, we will demonstrate those. Any projects that are for this repository. You can do wiki, security, depending on the version that you're using. You can also have insights, and again, a lot of settings that we can make for any of the for this repository, depending on your privileges as well. That is about it that we want to go through, because you can figure out most of the stuff going through it.
Yeah, and there's user account settings in both Azure DevOps and GitHub that you can change as well. And just like Sander said, we won't go through all of those, because you can go through and figure out the majority of those. I think the most important one to realize is that in both Azure DevOps and GitHub, in your personal account settings, you can create your personal access tokens, which can be quite important for a lot of things. Yep. Anyway, what's the main point here then, Sander, in this section?
So the main point I want you to take away from this section is how both Azure DevOps and GitHub are structured. They are kind of similar, but also very different depending on the features that you want to use.
Yeah, and I'm going to. Can you stop sharing your screen so that it goes back to mine?
Can.
Yeah,
we need slides.
That's quite easy to do.
So now we've covered the main admin stuff. Let's decide which one we're going to use for version control.
Oh, you mean like source safe?
Well, maybe something a little bit more modern. I actually work with this product, and I'm really happy that Microsoft stopped supporting it. So, no, not source safe. Maybe.
So okay, well, Azure DevOps includes a service called Azure Repos, as I covered quickly just now. When I went through the different default services that you get in Azure DevOps, so as you can see here, if I click on Azure Boards here, you can see I'll increase the resolution. I will increase. So if I go on the left-hand side here, you can see there's some default features that come with Azure Boards, like work items, Allows you to work with your work items in linear form. Oh, wrong one. Sorry, too far ahead. Repos. Sorry, everybody. That's the next session. So, as you can see here in Azure Repos, it's a visual representation of your source control. So, as you can see in Azure Repos, you can see the files that are in your source control repository, whether that's Team Foundation version control or Git repository. You can view your commits, your pushes, your branches, your tags, and your pull request details as well. So maybe that would be a good option for us to use, Sander, as a Git repository.
Maybe, but last time I checked, everybody in the team is using Git. Plus, Git hooks in really nicely with most or all the Microsoft tools, like, for example, Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code and Azure Data Studio. So I think people will see how it looks in ADS soon if they keep watching us. And to be honest, a lot of the developers use GitHub heavily. So if you go over to GitHub, Kevin, I'll quickly explain the layout. If you can explain the layout.
I kind of think you already went through this with everybody just now.
Yeah, quite
Okay,
fast,
well,
but
since you've got me to go here already, I will show something else instead, which is something that's recently been introduced in GitHub, which is pretty cool. Now, a lot of you are probably aware of this already, but now in GitHub, if you press the full stop, which is also known as a period, depending on which country you're in, when you're inside a GitHub repository like this, it will load up what's called GitHub code spaces, which I think is great. And it's basically a development environment in the cloud that you can use within GitHub. And this will probably look familiar to some of you because it's actually Visual Studio Code running behind the scenes. So the idea is, once it loads up fully, that we can view the actual repository here. And of course, I'm doing this live, so it's decided to take a while to load up. So it's got all the usual features that would come in Visual Studio Code here, like source control, etc. as well. You can also load up extensions and a few other things within GitHub as well. You can use it a few. So yeah, because I'm in a live demo, like I said, it's decided to load it slowly. I'm really hoping it's going to load up so I can show you exactly how it looks with the whole repository, like this. So as you can see here, it means that you can actually do your code development in the cloud from a web browser instead of using an application on your machine. And that's all I want to quickly show from this. Anyway, going back to working with the repository code anyway, it will only be for your development work though, right, Sander? Because it sounds like version control would be complicated for the ops folks to learn.
well, I don't agree. Actually, if you'll see when ops teams start using version control, they will actually start to perform better. I've worked in environments where we put all our documentation and scripting and everything in version control. And that actually was shared throughout the IT department and was a real upgrade in professional working and automation. And we started to perform better with that. So I actually think we should do that for both ops and dev teams.
Okay, so and what about branching strategies? Because I hear they're pretty important.
Yeah, so there's various ones that we can use. Two really uh, known ones are the Git flow and the GitHub flow.
So what's the difference between those two? Because they sound pretty similar to me, and I'm sure they will to some of our team members as well.
Yeah. So the major difference between the two is that with the Git flow, you don't directly merge into the main branch. There's always something like a dev or development branch, and you don't merge anything directly into the main branch unless it's a hotfix. With the GitHub workflow, there is not a development branch, so there are only feature branches, and as soon as they are tested successfully, they get merged into the main branch right away.
So can we do the same thing in both services?
Yeah, so us devs have been using source control for many years. So if we do something like pair programming between dev and ops members, they can actually get used to either product.
Okay, so what's to stop somebody coding their own release and pushing it straight to the main branch?
Yeah, that's an important one, right? So in both products, there's something called branching policies that we can use. So one of which is that two people have to approve updates to the main branch.
Well, that sounds good. I think we need to do that to be SOX compliant anyway, since we deal with financial data. So, big question is, which shall we use?
Well, before we decide, Kevin, why don't we check something? If you use the search, you can see there's millions of repositories available in GitHub, including the ones from Microsoft Workshops and SQL Server documentation. Plus, the DBA tools module is available there that probably a lot of DBAs are familiar with. And you can easily fork any repository in GitHub, and it's easier to submit those changes back to the main repository.
I can see they've got SQL Server documentation here, and like you said, there's all Microsoft uses for a lot of their documentation as well. Yeah, and since you've pointed out about all the other things that are available with GitHub as well at this moment in time, maybe we are better off using GitHub for our repositories.
Yeah. Well, anyway, there are a few main points we want you to take away from this section about version control. Azure DevOps supports two version control methods, TFVC and Git, and GitHub only has, like it says, only Git as its version control. Git has become the de facto standard nowadays. And with both products, you can secure your updates using branching policies.
Which is a very important thing to do.
Yeah.
So, we better discuss how we're going to organize our backlog items, especially since one of us did kind of show some of it a few minutes ago accidentally.
Well, in GitHub, we tend to deal with so-called issues for each repository, as I showed you earlier. So people add their issues in the repositories, and they can deal with them there. They're not always issues, they're called issues, but they can be feature requests or anything like that. You can even put a level of automation on them, and it's really easy to use, and people have been using this in GitHub for years. So let me show you how that looks. So I'm going to do something with projects as well. So I'm going to share my screen. Again, share the right one. There we are.
There you go.
So if I
Maybe
go to...
Can you press the Control Plus to zoom in a bit, because we are on StreamYard, so we have to kind of take that into consideration. There you go.
So that's a lot bigger. So in GitHub, we can do stuff with projects. As you saw earlier, if I go to create one, I can set the board name, give it a description, but we can also set the type of template that we want to use, so for the project. And as you can see here, we can do all kinds of stuff with Kanban, automated Kanban, Kanban with reviews, bug triage. So you can use this, you can use these templates to get your project started right away without having to set everything up. Of course, you can set it to none and set it to make it so that it is specific to your needs.
Yeah, and now's the part where we confuse people a bit to a degree, not intentionally, of course. As Sander mentioned, Sander, can you go back to the repository a minute as well?
Yep.
So, like Sander said, within each repository, you have a section called issues where you work with your issues, and Sandra control pluses a bit so nobody has to squint in. However, in addition to the each issues feature in the repository, GitHub announced earlier this year they're going to introduce something called GitHub issues as well, which is another way they intend to look into managing work items. It's currently at the moment in private preview, and me and Sander unfortunately aren't on the list, so we can't show you how it looks at this moment in time. However, what I can do is put a link in the chat so you can go and have a look at the blog post relating to the announcement about it. But when you hear GitHub issues, just remember that is actually different from the issues that you work with in your GitHub repository. So now we've covered that corner of interesting bit. Over to you, Sander.
Yeah, so anyway, I've heard a rumor that you spent about 2 hours answering questions about Azure boards before. So you might as well tear that band-aid off and show us what it can do.
Yeah, and I think some of you may get deja vu about the start. It is due to something that happened about 10 minutes ago. So, yes, Azure Boards is the way within Azure DevOps that you can manage your work items. And Azure Boards is a service within Azure DevOps, and it comes with a set of default features. You may have already heard me mention about work items earlier. You also have boards, which allows you to work in a Kanban or Scrumban kind of way. So it would be very familiar to you those of you who've used other board systems. You have backlogs, which will show you all your outstanding backlog items. As you can see, I've got it filtered on something here. It's quite useful to use. And this tends to be where product owners organize the priority of their work as well. And talking about sprints, it comes with sprint taskboard that you can view here, and you can do some other things here, and you can obviously use this on a per sprint basis. This is very useful as well. So if you are responsible for working with sprints, I do recommend looking into here. And finally, there's queries where you can create really good queries to find certain things out about the work items. For example, here I've got a query in place to find work items that aren't defined. Comes with a nice user query editor as well. And you can install something called a WYCL extension as well. So you can actually work with the code for the queries behind the scenes to query all your work items in Azure Boards.
I have a question, Kevin.
Oh, what's that?
Well, how are the backlog items organized for Scrum here?
Okay, well, that means I'll go back into here now. So if I go back to backlogs and I click on here, you can see that there is a default hierarchy that comes if you use the Scrum process, which is that your project or your board has one or more epics, which contains one or more features, which then contains one or more product backlog items, which is the default work item that you use for the Scrum process. If we were using the Agile process, it would be user stories instead of product backlog items by default. By the way, did I mention all the analytics and preview features we can potentially use with Azure Boards?
Steady on, Kevin. We only have 60 minutes.
I know. And that's why I'm going to quickly show something for everybody watching the day. So within Azure DevOps, there's something called analytics views you can use to produce data sets to Power BI, so you can query reports about it. In addition to that, GitHub have currently got, there is a new GitHub connector that you can use in Power BI, which is currently in preview, which means that you can view certain statistics or metrics, as you will, about the work you do within GitHub. For example, number of commits per branch, etc. And what you can do with a bit of imagination is create a report that shows details of what you've done during a sprint in Azure DevOps, which then connects to any work you do for it within GitHub. And that is exactly what this report is. And I do have a blog post as well that I will put in the chat. Well, like I said earlier as well, I did mention briefly that in Azure DevOps, I'd installed an extension to work with the code in the query a lot easier. And another good thing as well about Azure Boards, which some of you may have picked up on just now, is that it actually integrates with your GitHub repositories as well. So if I click on one of these work items, for example, and I better follow what I just said to Sandra and press Control+ so it shows up easier in the screen for everyone. If I scroll down, you can see that I linked this backlog item to a commit that was done in GitHub, and you can tell it's a commit in GitHub because you can see the OctoCat icon on the left-hand side here. And if I scroll down, you can see I've also linked it to an issue in my GitHub repository as well. So this is how, Sandra, we can use Azure Boards with GitHub repositories together, which I think is great.
Yeah, well, I think the decision is made. We'll use Azure Boards for our work items because it looks really, really nice.
Yeah. So the main thing to take away from this section, everybody, is that Azure Boards is a very powerful way of managing Scrum or Agile work visually, especially if you are a product owner. Plus, like I said, GitHub have just introduced GitHub issues, which is worth keeping an eye on as well.
So let's talk about CI/CD pipelines, which is where we will build and deploy our deliverables. The main question is, are we going to use Azure DevOps Pipelines or GitHub Actions for this?
Well, before we decide that, how does CI/CD work with SQL Server continuous integration or continuous delivery?
Well, the first thing you need to decide is whether or not you're going to use state-based or migration-based deployments.
Well, okay, what's the main difference between those two?
Well, with state-based deployments, what you do is your project is actually your one source of truth. So when you deploy your project to the target, any objects or code or anything like that is deployed to the target server right away. With migration-based, it's you will start at one point and then you will get iterations every time you make a release, and you have to apply all these changes, all the iterations in sequence to get to the desired result. So that is kind of the difference between the two. Both of them have a valid are valid to use. There are a lot of articles about that which will better suit your organization, and this discussion is a session on its own. So for us, I think that state-based would be better because we have a larger amount, we have a large development group, and doing this with a migration-based way would complicate things a bit.
Okay.
And it's actually pretty easy to create such a project, which I will demonstrate right now. So I'm going to share my screen. So people who know me in real life know that I'm lazy as hell when it comes to repetitive tasks. So when I had to do this action for about 30 to 40 projects, I had to create a solution, create multiple projects in that solution, put all the objects in there, and that was just a lot of wasted time.
Sander?
Yeah?
Can you control the plus on this one as well, please?
Yeah, I was already doing that. But this code is... So what I did was I created a template with the PS module development PowerShell module for one of the solutions that I set up precisely how I wanted it. And the only thing I need to run, and this is a lot of code, but the most important one in this part is this little line of code. And this will download my template from my GitHub repository and then create the entire solution for me. So if I run that, it will download it, install it, we'll extract it first, and then done. I just created my project. And if I open that, it's going to go to Visual Studio. And of course, Visual Studio is opening in my other screen. Bear with me for a minute. Sure. And I have two little projects in here. One for the data model. Unit testing is just the name of my database. And one for my unit tests. And from here, I can just do an import of my database. Let's just select this one. I just want the object type. And I can do an import and get all the objects for, let's say, for my production database if I want to have this particular version. So let's finish that. And now I have all my stored procedures and my tables in there. I don't need to do this in the test project because this project is referenced right in here, so I don't have to do this twice. And now I did this in 30 seconds, so you would have to, you could do this for all your projects in a couple hours if you want to.
This is on the README in your GitHub as well, to how to do this, isn't it? If I remember correctly. Yeah. I think for the benefit of time, it's just worth mentioning that you have your T-SQL team module to do the import as well.
Yeah, so if you look at my demos, I had created a PowerShell module for the that's called T-SQL test generator. I wanted to have some basic unit tests for all my databases. That included the collation. Are all my objects there? Are all my all the tables having the correct columns with the correct data types? Does my store procedure have the correct parameters with the correct data types? All that kind of stuff. It is in the. Do you want me to demo this demo?
No, because I was just going to quickly explain, because obviously to explain to everybody, like unit testing, it is one of the challenges we face when we do this deployment pipelines.
Yeah. So with this is just freely available on the PowerShell gallery. You can just install it, and what it does is it just takes a snapshot of your database, or just pulls all the objects out there and generates all the code for you. And it generates, like for a normal database, if we had a couple hundred tables, it creates like thousands of tests for you. In a couple minutes. So
it's very useful if you're working and you want to do the unit testing for SQL Server. And of course, unit testing is an important thing to do if you're using continuous integration with any form of deployment pipeline. So for when you're working with SQL Server, like Sander said, you can use T-SQL for unit tests, and he's rather conveniently done a useful tool for that. And of course, there's unit testing tools that you can use for other applications and services as well. So I think it's back over to me now. So if you share what, so I'm just going to quickly show Azure Pipelines now that we've covered that side of it. So if we go back into Azure DevOps now, and here is Azure Pipelines, and this is what you would use to manage your CI/CD deployments. If I extend this, I can scroll through the default features. So you have pipelines, which allows you to work with pipelines, whether they are YAML or GUI based. However, I do really recommend that you use the YAML based version. So for example, when you click on new pipeline, as you can see here, you can actually have your YAML file, which you use for your pipeline, in various different places. Like I said, you can still use the GUI version and classic editor, but YAML is pretty much the way forwards. Now, the other features that come in pipelines at the moment is environments, which is where you set your different types of environments for your deployments, like if you're using development, integration, staging, and production environments. And then you can set various settings in those environments, like various approvals and checks that have to take place before they get done. You have releases as well, which is the older style GUI release format. So in the past, it used to be builds and releases. Builds used to be purely GUI based, and releases was GUI based as well. So you do your builds and then use your releases to deploy whatever artifacts you created. However, things have changed. Pipelines is now YAML based. You can do both together. Then you have library, and this is where you can create what is known as your group variable groups. So basically you can group a collection of variables together, and you can also link your variable group to key vaults as well, which I'm sure will be an important thing to remember for a lot of you today, because obviously you want to use credentials that are in key vault. And there's task groups where you can group common tasks that you do in a pipeline together for use, and deployment groups, which I won't go into too much details about because it's based on something that's a bit over there as well. So that is a very fast introduction to Azure Pipelines. You're more than welcome to ask more after the session about it. Over to you, Sander.
So GitHub Actions is being heavily developed by both the GitHub, by GitHub itself and the community. Plus, if we have the existing repositories in GitHub, it makes sense to put our pipeline closer to the repository, in my opinion. And it appears that we have to have a lot of support for various services already. The only downside for you is that it doesn't support snaps, right?
Well, GitHub doesn't support snaps at the moment. There's not a GitHub action available for Azure Snaps, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
if that's so, then I'm a bit curious about, actually, let's go to the other one here. Bear with me. I'm fairly certain that I have to beg to differ on this one, because there's actually a GitHub action that came out last month that you can use for your Synapse workspace deployment.
Oh.
And it's in version 1, which pretty much means that it's GA for use. So if people want to, they can use this GitHub action themselves.
Well, I think the decision then is that we can use GitHub Actions on one condition.
Okay, what is this condition? I'm very curious now.
Well, you have the demo working with that SQL Server deployment with the project that we have.
Is that because you just want me to show GitHub Actions for everybody?
Yeah.
With your Data Studio and GitHub Actions together, yeah?
Yeah.
Right. So let me go over to. This is the price of having so many tabs. So this is Azure Data Studio then. And for those who aren't aware, you may have worked with SQL Server in the past and used something called SQL Server Management Studio. However, now there's an alternative called Azure Data Studio. One of the main benefits of this is that it's multi-platform. So this will actually run on Mac OS and Linux as well. Probably looks very familiar to some of you as well, because it looks like Visual Studio Code. Very good reason for that is actually forked from the original binaries. So to get this demo started in it, so that we can everybody can see CI/CD in action for SQL Server using GitHub Actions, I'm just going to save the change I've made to a local copy of the repository that's in GitHub. As you can see already in source control, it says you made a change. So I'm just committing the change to my local copy. And then I'm just going to sync it with the GitHub repository that we have created. And now if I go back into GitHub for you, we can actually see the action working. And I have to obviously do the same as what I told Sander, Control Plus, to make sure that everyone can see the screen. So if I click on the Actions tab, you can see it. A workflow is running. Now, please don't try and strain your eyes reading everything that's in here. When GitHub first starts running a workflow, it tries to show the entire workflow with all the separate jobs all together, squeezed in within this frame. Luckily, they also give you the ability to zoom in and pan around. I quite like the zooming in and panning around. So I took the building unit testing stages that comes with Sander's original tool. I then added 3 extra stages, and some of you may remember the diagram I showed at the start. That showed the deployments to integration, staging, and production environments as well. And those 3 are represented here in this workflow. And they are actually running on 3 separate Docker containers I have locally. So that is an option if you want to test things locally, is Docker containers. As long as you run it on your personal laptop, because the T's and C's of Docker have changed. So after I got it deployed to those 3 separate SQL instances, I actually tested syncing the repository to Azure DevOps. And that's something else we can do, Sander, to kind of not accept the defaults as well, is that we can actually have the repository in GitHub. And if people really want to work with Azure Pipelines as well, we can either synchronize the repository with Azure DevOps to start a workflow running there, or of course, link that pipeline to the same GitHub repository. We have options. So that worked. So I thought, okay, well, I thought I would experiment. And as you know, Sander, whenever we want to deploy the different types of SQL Server related databases, we're told to create a new database project every time. So you'd have one database project that purely delivers a SQL Server on premises, a specific version of SQL, and another database project to deploy to Azure SQL databases. And then, of course, another one to deploy to Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pools. However, as I mentioned earlier about doing things and not always accepting the defaults, I experimented a bit to see if we can use the one database project in our repository, like Sander showed you earlier, and create all the different DAT packs to deploy to the different types of SQL Server related databases just from that one project. So basically use that one project behind the scenes, create multiple DAT packs for the different versions of SQL Server. And it actually did work. And if I go here into the workflow and I click on edit, so you can see how it looks when you actually work on it here. And the reason I've just zoomed out a bit is just to show you all that you can actually view all the search for various GitHub actions in the marketplace here, if you want to, on the right hand side. However, to show the code, I'm just going to zoom back out again. So I can scroll down, and what I'm just going to do is quickly find the line of code that's got the PowerShell in, which we will be using for the conversion, because I didn't quite get it out earlier. So here's an example. So what we do behind the scenes, we run a batch of PowerShell, so to speak, inside our workflow. It copies the normal SQL Server database project that we've got in our repository to a staging location on the server that's doing all the processing of the workflow for us. It then changes the line in the SQL proj file, so it's ready to be changes it to be deployed to an Azure SQL database instead. And then from there, once we've made that change in the rest of the PowerShell code, we create a new DAT pack based on the change SQL proj file, which we then publish to GitHub as well, which means we end up with multiple DAT packs that are available. At the moment, there's no artifacts available in this particular one. So let's see if we can go back to one I created earlier. So if we click on this one that I did earlier, you can see it created 4 separate artifacts. And these separate artifacts contain a different DAT pack for a different version of SQL Server to deploy to. So we wanted to show you this to show you that you don't have to accept the default ideas, and that you can use some imagination to create multiple DAT packs for different versions of SQL Server related databases based on one SQL Server database project in your one repository. So you keep one source of truth. So what do you think about that, Sander?
Well, that's all well and good. Well, can you do approvals like you can do in Azure DevOps?
Yes, you can. So if I go to the settings section here, what you can actually see now, if I scroll down, is that you can use environments. And it's a similar idea as using environments in Azure DevOps. So here, if I click on production, you can see that the two of us have set the reviewers. And I can set a wait timer as well for delayed deployments. And instead of waiting for that to look, I think we better move forward for the benefit of time. So that is how you can configure your approvals in GitHub Actions. And again, you're more than welcome to ask us questions about GitHub Actions at the end of this session as well, which is in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Anyway, back over to you, Sander.
Yeah, so just a reminder, you can use the SSDT deployment tool that I showed you earlier for both Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions. Do we have time for a comparison between the YAML and between the YAML for
We've only
GitHub
got 5
Workflow?
minutes, so we'll skip through the comparison for now.
Yeah.
What we can do afterwards is share the link to the GitHub Actions workflow schema in the chat, so you can go and have a look there and see how it looks.
The syntax for both YAML for both the solutions is quite similar, but it's also sometimes a bit different. But it's easy to overcome. So.
Yep, indeed. And I will just quickly put the link for the workflow syntax in the chat. So, and I've noticed somebody's already put the Azure DevOps learning pipeline, learning path from Microsoft Learn in the chat as well. If you go through that, you'll learn a lot more about the syntax used in Azure Pipelines. So you can actually use GitHub Actions to look for a whole host of preset templates as well. So if we click on the workflow, you can see you can find other templates as well. Anyway, let's quickly talk about runners.
Yeah.
So runners are basically, shall we do the fast version of this one? It's 4 minutes.
Yeah.
So runners are effectively what you use to do all of the processing of the build and release tasks in GitHub Actions. And because we are using GitHub Actions, we will have to have a GitHub runner installed. And because of our various issues, we're probably better off creating our own GitHub runners internally instead, Sander.
We can go a few minutes after the time, so we can.
That's fine.
But maybe that is all good. But remember, a lot of us are developers, Kevin, and we don't want to build our own servers. So what is that?
These are actually instructions inside a GitHub repository on how you can create your own GitHub Action runners. Funny thing is, you actually use the same instructions for your Azure DevOps agents as well. So if you go straight to this repository, you'll get instructions there and get a better idea of how Azure DevOps agents and GitHub runners can be built.
Cool. So I suppose now you're going to tell me this is gonna be better run as a better off running this as a service than.
To be honest, that depends. If you're deploying it onto a dedicated server somewhere for it to be used in your network environment, then yeah, it makes sense to run it as a service. However, if you are like ourselves and you test multiple GitHub runners and Azure DevOps agents on your machine, your services command can get filled up very fast. So it might be a better idea instead to install your agents and runners in separate folder locations on your machine, and then run them manually as and when you need to, like as you can see here. So, and it's also good to use that PowerShell screen as well for viewing the output, because I've noticed sometimes that there's a delay in the GUI, which is the same for a lot of things. Now, I know we can do automated tests in GitHub Actions, and we've just seen that to a degree with the unit tests as well. So before we go too far into this subject though, can I make a suggestion about organizing our manual tests?
Yeah, go ahead.
Right, so if I go back and get the right one. So within Azure DevOps, if I scroll down, you can see we can actually manage tests in Azure Test Plans. Since we already have the licenses for it, Sander, I propose that we use this. Because since we've already decided to use Azure boards, this will actually work quite nicely with it. As you can see here, for the benefit of this discussion, I actually created one earlier.
Cool.
So here is a test case which you can use within a manual inside Azure Test Plans. You can put pictures in here. You can put ticks on if they pass the test or crosses on if they fail. We can put a comment in if they failed. So for example, I can put it broke and I can create a bug. And this bug will actually go into Azure boards for us. So it's quite useful. And we've got the licenses. So I suggest we just use this.
Yeah.
So
we better briefly discuss artifacts discuss artifacts here, because I think this is going to be a tough call to do.
Yeah, and obviously as well, we'll have to do a bit of explanation here as well, because in Azure DevOps, you use Azure artifacts to share various things like NuGet packages with others. So it's basically, even though it's called artifacts, it's a package management system in Azure DevOps. For example, you can create a NuGet package to share with others within your organization within Azure artifacts.
Yeah. So to help remove some jargon for you, a feed is basically a source that people can access to download packages, which can be online somewhere or on your own network. For Linux-oriented people, it's basically a repository. And these feeds can be configured to host a variety of package types, including NuGet, NPM, Maven, Python, and universal packages.
Yeah, universal packages just means any type of files pretty much, and it's ideal for large binaries. And as you can see here, we actually adopted it for what's known as DBA tools PowerShell module. So which is a very popular PowerShell module for people that work with SQL Server databases. And one of our presenters today may be a major contributor to it.
Who is that?
Anyway, back to the packages in GitHub, Sander.
Yeah. So we can upload packages into GitHub using the packages, which supports all kinds of all things like NuGet packages and Docker images as well. And we can even store the PowerShell modules like DBA tools in it.
Okay, so what shall we use?
Well, I suggest for now we try to use the packages in GitHub in case we need to use it for GitHub Actions. Plus, we can look to store a Docker image for my T-SQL unit tests. And if it turns out we need to store large binaries of various types in the future, we can look at Azure artifacts instead.
Well, that sounds good. And there are other things that I'm looking forward to using as well as part of this. I mean, we can look to use dashboards in Azure DevOps if we want to, so we can view information about Azure DevOps and GitHub together. Obviously, analytics views I mentioned earlier, the data sets that we can use to produce, show data basically to Power BI. So yeah, and there's other stuff in GitHub as well I'm looking forward to using. I know some members of your development team are already using the GitHub mobile app so they can stay good on the go. Is there something I've forgotten, Sander?
The wiki?
Oh yeah, so we can actually use the wiki. We're spoiled for choice here because we can use the wiki in the repositories for stuff that we do. And let me just control minus so it shows easier for people there. So we can use the wiki here in GitHub Actions for our repositories. We can also use a wiki on the homepage of either the Azure DevOps project or the GitHub organization as well. Something else I know, Sander, I put a smile on developers' faces. That is that Azure DevOps and GitHub both have a CLI we can use.
Yeah.
And do you want to talk about the organizations?
And remember that everybody is eligible to create their own private Azure DevOps and GitHub organization to test things on. If you have a Visual Studio subscription and you create your own organization, it will bring you additional benefits as well. So just in case you want to test out things without breaking your organization from within the company.
Yeah. So finally, towards the end of the session, we just want to just want to confirm what we've decided then, Sander, for the benefit of us and anybody else listening. So we've decided to use the following services together within Azure DevOps and GitHub. So we decided to use Azure Boards to manage our work items, repositories within GitHub for use, and as you can see, information goes both ways. We've decided to use GitHub Actions for our CI/CD deployments. We've decided at this moment in time to use GitHub packages to see if they will be the best option for us moving forwards. We decided to use Azure test plans for our manual tests, and then if there are issues, you can feed the bugs back to Azure Boards. And then we've decided to use Power BI to view our metrics, which is an important part for any team that works in a DevOps related way. And as I mentioned earlier, you can actually view data from both Azure Boards and GitHub repositories together inside a report.
So now that we know all that, where shall we begin?
Well, I suggest we start by getting both teams together and explain to them what we're trying to achieve, because it's very important to get everybody in the team on board before we start moving forwards.
Anyway, that's all we've got time for today. We kind of went over a bit, but it was important to get all that covered. And I wonder if there are any questions.
Hi, I'm back. Thank you for the great presentation, Kevin and Sander. Actually, we don't have any questions on the chat, but we have feedback from someone, Rolf Raven. He said, thank you very much for the session. It was very useful. So yes, thank you so much. It was good. I have a question though, personally, because I've been listening in the backstage, learning from your session. I'm a developer and I'm curious about using, I've used both Azure DevOps and GitHub for repos and deployments. I mean, which tool should I use? Is it GitHub or Azure DevOps? I know that they're both work almost the same, but not the same. I mean, which should I use?
Do you currently use either at the moment?
Yeah, I use a lot for my personal project. I use a lot of GitHub, and I've also used Azure DevOps. But I know that GitHub was bought by Microsoft. So, and I heard that there's like an ongoing migration. I mean, will DevOps be gone in a few years? Do you know anything about that? No?
I know that Azure DevOps is still being worked on at the moment.
Yeah, yes.
It's still being developed. So if you go to the actual Azure DevOps homepage, you can actually find their roadmap. I don't have the link to hand. I actually used to have it to hand. I'll see if I can find it in a bit and put it in the chat. But yeah, Azure DevOps, they are obviously both being developed.
Yes.
Azure DevOps and GitHub still very much so. As I mentioned earlier, GitHub are bringing out GitHub issues, which is their potentially one way that you can work with work items. If your stuff is in GitHub, you might want to use GitHub Actions, because then you're working closer to your repository since it's already in GitHub. There are quite, as Sander mentioned earlier, both GitHub themselves and members of the community are creating GitHub Actions that are publicly available for use. So people will notice when you're searching in the marketplace for GitHub Actions, they're not always done by GitHub. They're actually also done by the community as well at large.
Yes.
It is a big adoption with it, so it's worth looking into.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And I really like the collaboration, the how GitHub and Azure DevOps can work together. Just like what you said, don't accept the default. So you can have one section of your CI/CD in one place and the other on GitHub. So I like that. Just like your T-shirt.
Yeah.
All right. Like we're out of time, but we got one more comment before we end our session. We have no questions, but just great feedback. Interesting and useful session, and thank you so much. And I thank you also as well, Sander and Kevin, for sharing your knowledge about these great technologies. And I also thank you all the audience that joined us live today. So this session is recorded and will be on demand and can be shared to your friends who missed this. So thank you so much for today. And I hope everyone a great weekend, and see you on next 2 weeks in the next session. Thank you so much, Kevin and Sander.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
Bye.